Both places at least once a year.
That's not a
And
bad.
the grandchildren come home for a month during the summer at our beach house.
I can do roll
We
call
see them
again
pretty
later.
regularly.
That's pretty good.
The Paris son-in-law's the chief of Secret Service for all of Europe. But they're coming home. They've been there 5 years. His assignment's up. They'll be back summer.
Should go to
sometime.
DC.
That is
If he doesn't leave the service yet, he's at a point that he can't go any higher
They might do something
unless he's the director. And who would want to do that now?
different right now.
Craziness is going on. So I get appointed, do the right thing again.
We're ready to start. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome commission members, advisors, staff, on-site visitors, and online listeners to the February 13th, 2020 monthly meeting of the North Carolina Professional Educator Preparation and Standards Commission. The Standards Commission develops and recommends to the State Board of Education rules related to all aspects of educator preparation programs. I'm Michael Marr, co-chairman of the Professional Educator Preparation and Standards Commission, and I call this meeting to order. Our agenda and materials are available online through the DPI website, www.ncpublicschools.org, on the SBE meetings link. The meeting is also audio streamed through a link located at the bottom of the e-board agenda. I'll now read the ethics statement that is required of us. Commission members are reminded that it is our duty to avoid conflicts of interest and the appearance of conflicts of interest as we handle the work of this commission. Does any member of the commission know of any conflict of interest or any appearance of conflict with respect to any matters coming before us at this meeting? If so, please state them for the record. If during the course of the meeting you become aware of an actual or apparent conflict of interest, please bring the matter to the attention of the chair. It will then be your duty to abstain from participating in discussion on the matter and from voting on the matter. We'll begin with approval of the agenda, February 13th, 2020. Commission members, you've had an opportunity to review the proposed agenda for today's meeting. Do I have a motion to approve this agenda for the February 13th, 2020 meeting?
So moved.
Second.
It's been moved and seconded. Any discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. We don't have a quorum. We don't. Commission members, you've had an opportunity to review the proposed agenda for today's meeting. Oh, sorry. We're on that. We've done that. Approval of the minutes for January 16th, 2019. The minutes from our previous commission meeting on January 16th, 2019 have been prepared and made available to you. Do I have a motion to approve these minutes?
Motion.
Second.
It's been moved and seconded. Any discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Okay, so we'll move on to NCDPI staff updates and discussion. Due to the requirement of quorum, the State Board of Education updates will be split into two parts. The first part will be presented by Drs. Kim Evans and Andrew Seiberg. Dr. Seiberg will then continue with a discussion of his item, the EPP Accountability Model Proposal. For the second part, Dr. Tom Tomberlin will continue and complete the updates from the State Board of Education.
Good morning. Good morning, everyone.
Your mic's not on, I don't think.
Good morning, everyone. I'm going to start with Teach NC. They presented at the last state board meeting, and they pretty much presented what we had already heard, but I wanted to give you a few highlights of what state board members actually asked them after their presentation. So the first question was around whether they were targeting certain demographics for their recruiting efforts. And they said yes, that they were, and that they were doing this through certain recruiting resources, and they were looking at particular age groups, such as looking at folks early in the recruiting period, thinking about those that are going to college, coming from high school, and catching them early. They also, State Board also asked about community colleges and whether this is also included in this recruitment platform. And they said that 40% of college students are interested in teaching, and they just need some type of support out there. And so they want to have a type of one-pager that they can easily give to these types of people to target them coming into the teaching profession, to make it really easy for them to grab onto the profession and be part of it. And this kind of segues into the one-stop shop, which is what State Board had talked about, and they said that they love that piece, that this could be a one-stop shop for recruitment, for teaching, and that Teach and See, so Brenda Berg was talking about, yes, LEAs, that they've started working with LEAs and the EPPs to then have them on the platform, but also the job board piece, adding that in there, so it's not just for recruiting new teachers or new folks to come into the profession, but also established folks that they can then grab a job at the same time and look at that job board across the state. And also, they focused on, there are 41 LEAs that have been added to the platform or will be added to the platform, but that 6 of the larger school districts are missing, and they are still going to extend further invitations to the LEAs as well as EPPs. And the last question was, how do you get word out to a target audience? And there were several different ways. There were 4 different ways. They looked at CTE coordinators. They had posters in K-12 high schools. The LEAs have profiles, and then they're building partners to share back and form partnerships and then be able to share out to their constituents. Are there any questions about that particular update? Thank you.
Good morning, commission members.
More.
Hope everyone's doing well. I'm going to give you an update on the accountability model that was pushed from this body over to the board. And there's a little PowerPoint associated with that, and Kim's going to work to get that up. Essentially, we presented the accountability model as was approved here, and the board heard it, and I'm not going to quote here, but generally what the feedback from the board was that this is a great first step, if not even a second step, but there are a couple things that they would like this group to consider in a revision, a couple of revisions towards this accountability model that was presented. And there are essentially 4 of them. Before I get into the details of the 4 of them, I just want to remind everyone about the process, because this rarely happens that we send something as a recommendation from this body to the board and then the board sends it back. Okay, so the way the law was put together was that this back and forth can only happen essentially one more time. And if it happens one more time, it's at the discretion of the board then to assign folks within the department to create the accountability model in this case, right? So essentially not me, but the commission has sent the first pass over to the board. The board has rejected that. It comes back to you all for a second go around to consider what they're interested in for potential revisions. It's your discretion to take your time and do that, do your due diligence and think carefully about what they've asked you to think about. And you can choose to stay with what you have, and you can choose to submit something entirely different. But this is effectively will be your last pass on this before the board either passes it or assigns the department to actually come up with the accountability model. Yes, Dr. Houston.
Am I dreaming something up that I thought I read, and that was that we could send directly to the legislature?
I have no knowledge of that being in 599 that we would.
So maybe I added it to 599.
You may have added it to 599. What I can say is that the lawmakers can choose to change things at any given time, and that may change what's happening. But the give and take that happens with this commission is between itself and the board, and back and forth there, not directly to the lawmakers.
You might want to mention JLEOC for folks that were not.
Sure. Since last we met, there's been so much going on. I appreciate you reminding me of that, Dr. Moore. So after we met, we had the board meeting, and then while the board meeting was getting set up, the department got a note from the JLEOC, that's the Joint Legislative Education Oversight Committee, who basically are thinking very carefully about a variety of education issues and make recommendations to the lawmakers to pass law. They wanted an update on the accountability model, and my initial response to them was, you should wait until we have the board meeting, because we don't know whether the board will approve the accountability model that has been proposed or not. And the response back was, that's not going to happen. We have to go with where we're at. We know it's a mark in time. We know that it's pending board approval, and you just provide that with some clarity. And so to that end, Dr. Tomerlin and I presented. There were along with the two of us. The presentation was actually really a very good and thorough investigation of it, because they also had there a representative from the EPPs, the Teachers of Tomorrow leader was there to talk from their perspective. There was a private institution there, Dr. Godwin presented, yeah. And then there was a public institution representative, the dean from App State was there.
Dr. Spooner. Yeah.
Dr. Spooner, yeah. And so basically they got to hear what the proposal was, and that it's going to the board, and the committee wanted to hear how is 599 being implemented, where are there snags, where are there possible things that could be improved with some tweaks in legislation, so on and so forth. So despite the fact that we didn't get to the board making a decision, yay or nay, that happened, and that happened the day before we went to the board. So we presented that, and then we went to the board, and the board saw this and thinks it's again a very good first and second effort, and they're sending it back to think about essentially 4 areas. So before I go into the 4 areas, are there any other questions about the process, or any questions about what's transpired since last time we met? I know that was a lot of information. Did I catch everything? Do you want to add anything, Dr. Tomerlin?
You may have clarified this and I missed it, but I wanted perhaps the commission to be sure that you got the order of events right. We actually presented to the JLEOC before the board meeting. So I just wanted to be sure that everybody was aware of that. So what you had recommended was what was presented to the JLEOC and then to the board. So there wasn't any kind of discussion from the board when we presented that model.
Thank you. Any other questions? Okay. So let's go through, and now I'm leveraging the PowerPoint for those of you who are listening in remotely. Essentially, there were 4 revision requests. I'm going to go through each one, but there's a slide here, the slide 2, it sort of walks through the 4 of them. The revision requests, and this came from a motion at the board meeting, was 1, for the commission to include diversity in the accountability now, as opposed to waiting, and piloting it over the next 2 years. And specifically to explore ways that you could consider growth and diversity relative to the general population of each college or university in the assessment of diversity. So there was a specific suggestion about, can we look at growth over time, and there was a specific request to consider, is there a way that we could, we recognize that institutions have different demographics, can we accommodate that in some meaningful way? And keep in mind that the inner workings of this group, when we talked about the different ways we could unpack diversity, the board hasn't really seen that yet. I presented what was not what was possible, but what was the specific recommendation. So I'm going to go into that in a couple of slides. But so the point is, some of these things that they're recommending are things that were already discussed within this group. Second area is to consider elevating the value of EdTPA and PPAT. Right now, if you think about Domain 1 has 4 measures in it, and those 4 measures are equal weight. And so a suggestion was to think about, well, if EdTPA and PPAT, that assessment is one of the assessments that the institutions have the most direct control over, or the most direct impact, could or should there be a stronger consideration in terms of its value or weight within that domain. Okay. The third one is, can we establish a floor to the minimum number of surveys required for use in the accountability model? So essentially there, this idea of if Andrew University only has 1 survey response from a candidate, can that survey response be generalizable to the quality of the experience? And so this is the question that was brought up. More on that in a minute. And then the fourth would be they recognize what I brought up with this group in last month's meeting, this concern about the duration of the sanctioning period, and that once you get into sanctions, there's a very short time window to get out of sanctions. That was also mentioned at the JLEOC meeting, and they said they would like a more formal, let's come up with an actual duration or a process to extend that sanctioning period so that folks do have a chance to improve before they're revoked. So what I'd like to do is remind you first of, I'm going to go unpack each of these a little bit and give you some information. So this first one is around, let's see here, that's weird that's there. Well, the argument from the board is that there were a couple representatives of the board that really felt strongly that diversity needs to be in there now and not 2 years from now. And the underpinnings is that it's aligned with the core mission of the board. The idea of increasing diversity is very important to members of the board, and so that's the rationale for bringing that back. And if we can go to the next slide here. So remember, this slide is here just to remind you of what was proposed. The proposal was to look at essentially a 3-domain weighted composite average, and to look at the diversity domain as a 4th possibility, and to collect the data and basically create a more informed outcome so that we're not tripping into potentially sanctionable situations that may be ill-informed because we don't have enough data on it. That was the proposal that went to them. And if you can click on the next slide, the original discussion, as I mentioned a couple minutes ago, around this topic was a 4-domain model and incorporating diversity into it. And the original conversation, it gave the diversity component 10% of the weighted average, and they were looking at essentially 5 criteria within that domain. Now, to help get your mind around how this would function, because that 4th domain can't function the way the other domains work in terms of how you calculate them, the next slide walks through how we would assess this, and this gets at some of what the board members were suggesting. Essentially, we could look at this, and the recommendation from the subcommittees was to look at this effectively three different ways. The first is for each of the categories that are on the left there, percent people of color, percent male, percent Pell eligible, so on and so forth. Each of those then, an EPP could meet the standard effectively 3 different ways. The first way would be to meet or exceed a set standard. So if we were going to set a standard, and again, I'm not making the standard, I'm making one up just for a point of conversation. One thing you could say is the teacher population should reflect the demographics of the student population. and therefore we could say, you know, that X percent of folks should be male, and it should be almost 50% that would be male, or something like that.
You're talking about the entire university.
The entire state should function at that whatever the rate is. Forget about we're going to get to some other options, but this is one way is to set a state expectation of the percent of people of color, the percent male, the percent Pell eligible, so on and so forth. There's a variety of ways you could do that. You could set target goals and move those goals over a period of years, so on and so forth. So if an institution meets or exceeds that point, then they would have met that criteria. If they don't have that, a second way for an institution or an EPP to meet each of those candidate demographic expectations would be to meet or exceed the institution average. So in that case, we're saying, well, if you don't meet a particular state expectation, can you at least meet within your own institution? And therefore taking into account that institutions have very diverse differences, across each institution. So if I don't have very many male students, maybe meeting or exceeding that institution average wouldn't be quite as heavy a lift as if the state was, much higher than that, right? So that's the second way. If an institution does not meet that, then the third criteria would be to look at year-over-year growth. So to say, well, I didn't meet the state standard. I also didn't meet my institution average, but I'm moving in the right direction. So from the previous year to the current year, I've moved in a positive direction. I'm not stagnant. I'm not declining, and so I would have met there, right? So any one of those three could apply to having met the expectation of each of those candidate demographics on the left. And then we would need to assign a scale associated with that. So in this case, there are currently in the one that we discussed, there are 5 candidate demographic sort of subgroups that are being looked at. If you've met all 5 of them, you would get a maximum of 4 points. If you met 4 out of 5, you would still get the maximum 4 points, and so on and so forth, down to 1 out of 5 would get you, that would potentially put you in a sanctionable situation for that particular portion.
So we might have talked about this. What is the geography?
That has to do with urbanicity.
Meaning what? Like we should have more students coming from urban areas, less students, more students coming from rural areas? I don't really know what that means.
Yeah, I think it's at the discretion to figure out how you would want to define that. Certainly rural communities was one of the areas that was discussed. Urbanicity, urban settings was an area that was discussed. We'd have to set very specific parameters around that.
The other thing, I don't know if we've talked about this either, so this disproportionately impacts preparation programs that are university-based. And if I'm a program that runs out of like the Central Carolina RESA or Guilford County, how do they meet some of these things, right? So their geography is dictated by where these people teach. I don't know, right? So are they going to be calculating first gen? Are they going to be calculating Pell eligible after someone has already graduated from college? And that seems weird, right? That basically, like, these folks are already in the profession. And so if we're not going to count that for those programs, then, again, we've set a different standard.
Right. Well, I mean, just for point of clarity, whatever it is that we're applying here on the accountability side of things, there is no doubt we are trying to set an expectation across all EPPs, whether they are institution or non-institution conferring, right? So, so that is, these are issues that are coming up, right? So, they have to be worked out, because what we don't want to do is set up something that would be unfair to some. Sure. Or disadvantageous.
We've got alt-cert programs that exist both inside and outside of EPPs that they're not necessarily recruiting. People are coming to them.
Right. So, Dr. Tomberlin is going to jump in here.
So before, I want to express some thoughts on this particular measure, and this seems to be kind of a strong sticking point in what might be approved by the State Board of Education. And my comment comes from some of the the letter that was sent to the board and staff members from Incacti, and I thought that was a very interesting. There were some really great comments in there, and one of the things that really struck me, and this is not a but to the diversity measure, this is an and. It's becoming increasingly clear to me that we don't have any good information on the root cause of the lack of diversity in our schools of education or our ed prep programs. So we're applying a policy decision in the absence of understanding the root cause, and that can be a little dangerous or not yield the results that we want to achieve. So I'm not making this as a let's don't do this, but an and while we do this and figure this out, the department or the state in general should be engaged in understanding what is keeping our minority and our underrepresented populations out of the teaching profession. And understanding that better can help us apply policy levers that could address those root causes rather than, I feel like in some ways we're making assumptions about what's going on and thinking this lever will achieve the right result. And that may or may not be true. I'm not saying that this won't achieve the outcome. I'm just saying we've kind of cart and horse this a little bit. Let's try to understand why do males of color not want to be teachers? And that should lead, that understanding, that in-depth qualitative research should then lead us to informed policy decisions to make sure that we are addressing that problem and lowering those barriers.
Okay, so again, this was the thinking from the subcommittee, and obviously, Dr. Marr, to your point, it's not. There are other ways to do this, and I think some more careful consideration on this very complex issue is likely warranted for next steps. Let's unpack number 2. I think is the next slide. Oh, the questions that need answered here would be, one, does Pepsi want to recommend a diversity domain into the model? And if that answer is yes, then there's a variety of other thinking that needs to go on, from confirming the variables. Are those 5 subgroups that have been identified, are they the correct ones? Are those the ones that you want to set the domain on? There are some different ways to meet expectations. Obviously, we wouldn't be able to do a growth model unless we had 2 years worth of data, right? So if we were to try and implement immediately, we would only be able to look at setting a state expectation or an institution expectation unless there are additional ideas that come out of this group. I'm leveraging off of what has been discussed over the past year. And then we could apply a growth model in the 3rd year when we'd have 2 years worth of data collected. Does that make sense? All right, and then there's a couple other questions on the next slide, which would be, we would need to confirm the scoring of the variables in domain 4, and then ultimately set the weighting of that domain within the broader weighted composite model. So those are some initial questions that come to mind when we think about if it is the will of the commission to proceed. It is obvious that the board feels very strongly about the commission thinking very carefully about including diversity in some capacity. If that is the will, then there's some additional work that needs to be done to think that through. So that's
Andrew, can
sure.
I just make a comment?
Of course.
I don't think we're going to be voting on anything, but and I hesitate to even do it because Tom just clarified my concerns. I mean, he articulated that very well. It just almost seems like this could be punitive, and we have not identified what the root cause is. And it's the same thing that we feel from an LEA perspective when someone is saying we need to make our hire folks that reflect the diversity within our classrooms. Well, we really want to do that, right? We really, really want to do that. But until we get to the root cause as to why we're not producing enough educators, and I almost feel like there's a goal to put some type of punitive measure in place And then maybe if we do that, then everybody will just flock to the universities and say, hey, I want to enroll in the program because I see that you've got this down as one of your domains that need to be measured, right? We've really just got to figure out what is the root cause, and I don't have the answer to that, but it really, it just strikes home because it's not just an EPP or an IHE issue, it is an LEA issue as well, right? Not that we cannot be penalized for not hiring when there's not a diversity in our pool that we're looking to hire, right?
Thank you.
This is Wesley. I totally agree with what Linda said, and some of the comments talked about that this accountability model should measure outputs and not necessarily inputs. And I don't know the answer either, but I definitely agree with all of Linda's comments.
May I speak, Mr. Chairman? Yes. I agree with all of what's been said, but I don't think anything's going to happen until we create an urgency. We talk about it's a problem. Whose problem is it? Who's going to do anything about it? I don't think we can. I felt strongly about this at the last meeting, but I was on the telephone, so I couldn't express my concern. If we don't address this issue, who's going to? And unless we cause things to happen, even though they may be punitive, we are going to build a coalition around finding a solution. We know the demographics that we're going to be dealing with in our schools. I mean, it's clear. Browning of America is a thing. If we don't find some incentives, maybe some sanctions, but I actually think these sanctions could lead to incentives with some support. Schools of education are not going to solve this by themselves. The General Assembly is going to have to jump in. Other policy making groups are going to have to jump in. But unless we do something that makes it happen, we'll be talking, I won't be because I'll be off the commission, but the next round of commission members are going to be talking about the same thing. I know we can't vote on anything today, but I hope if this goes back to the subcommittee that we don't say to them, think about it, that we say to them, come back with a plan, flawed as it may be, and let's do something. And that's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
I don't understand the rationale of sanctioning people and that will make things happen.
I've seen it happen a number of times. When you get people, institutions, nobody's going to walk away from the institutions that we have. The schools of education are not going to be sanctioned and go away. But they can't do this by themselves. So somehow or another, we have to create a need for something to happen. And talking about it isn't going to make a difference.
I completely agree. And at the JLEOC, they were showing data from year to year, particularly kind of looking at what domain 4 might look at. And there were stars over particular demographics because they didn't reach a certain level of 10. So on the first year, there were 5 stars. The second year, there were 4. So it meant that there was growth in one of those movements. And I found that particularly important because the gentleman presenting was talking about how they don't look at this as being sanctioned. They look at it as the impetus for continuous improvement. And I think, I hope that that's the spirit that we're looking at this with, is that we know that there's a need. We know that 52% of our students in public schools in North Carolina are students of color. So we know we need to engage more teachers of color in this process. I love what whoever, I don't know who was on the phone right there, just talked about maybe looking at this rather than inputs and outputs. But I do believe that we need to continue the discussion as to how we as a commission can help make this more of a priority. It's a systems change. So where is our role in that systems change?
Well, the other thing that,
And this is Jabari Wallace. Can y'all hear me?
Yes, sir.
Okay, and I definitely agree with Freebird and the gentleman right before Freebird. We definitely need to. I don't think it has to be a hard sanction. It could be an expectation, but I really think us taking action and putting this as a priority, we can get feedback from the EPP where if they achieve the level, if they don't achieve the level. But at least we'll have a starting point. I've just been listening to the meeting the whole time, and it keeps going in circles and circles about we don't know what the problem is. We don't know what the problem is. This is the starting point right here. We can hear from our EPPs to give us data on why they could not accomplish the expectation. That will at least give us a starting point for further consideration later on. So we are doing something. We are taking some action.
I love the idea of tracking the data. I'm just concerned about the expectations. I love the idea of having some goals and some strategic planning at each EPP, but I'm just not so certain about sanctioning an EPP for not meeting a specific goal.
Exactly.
Yeah, well, when I think that's, go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
No, and I agree with. I mean, first year out and a hard sanction like that, I definitely agree with you on that. Maybe the sanction can come in the form of a warning. Maybe it's not called a sanction at all. Give them 1 year to actually get their feet under the ground of what we're trying to do. And then the next year, maybe put something in place. But the most valuable piece of this is getting that feedback from the EPP of why they cannot attain that standard. Then we can move from there and we can build on that.
So, which I think is what we proposed in this model, right? Was the idea that we would be collecting data, that we would be moving forward, we'd have 2 years of data before we decided to do anything punitive. I think the other thing that Freebird brought up that's really important is this idea of the small number. So you're going to have in this model in the first couple of years, only a handful of institutions are going to be evaluated because we have campuses that their number is going to be too small. So we're going to have the majority of programs that are going to have an asterisk
For 2 years.
for 2 years. And so you're only going to have maybe 5 or 6 programs out of 50 some programs that actually have any data. And so you run the risk of then saying, look, these 5 programs can't, right? And so we set up this kind of narrative that individual programs aren't meeting a standard, but we haven't even established what the baseline is because we don't have the data from everyone. And again, we're only really evaluating traditional EPPs, yet we have these other programs in the state that apparently, based on the JLEOC, have considerable numbers of candidates. So, yeah, I think we certainly need to have more discussion, but I'm in total agreement that it is an urgent problem. I don't think anyone disagrees with that. We got a lot of data. We got a lot of feedback back from EPPs this week. I did. I know Patrick did. We got them from both public and private. Everyone recognizes the problem and wants to work on a solution. The concern is that they're going to be sanctioned for something that's outside of their control. Because EPPs don't control admissions. Universities control admissions. So we can only take the students, they can only take the students who are admitted in the first place. And we have other barriers to entry. And I know this is like my dead horse that I beat every time we're in here. The biggest barrier to entry for first generation and students of color is the praxis core. It disproportionately eliminates those students from ever entering the pipeline. So we narrow it even before we begin. That, to me, is the elephant in the room that we don't seem to want to deal with. And folks can talk about that that's lowering standards. It is not lowering standards because the test has no bearing on whether or not someone is going to be an effective teacher.
I feel like it's a situation that if EPPs and this commission aren't proactive, somebody's gonna do it for you. And then it may not be that pretty. There are programs who clearly have, and don't ask me to name one, I'm making this up. I'm sure there are programs out there that have created incentives to get a particular audience into their programs.
Yeah, but
Maybe not just in schools
but
of
they're,
education.
but they're predominantly post-bac. And if I am a post-bac, so if I've graduated from a university, I bypass the praxis core.
Well, I'm not even thinking just about education. I'm thinking about where there are programs that incentivize particular audiences to try to get women in or to try to get men into what is predominantly a female track.
Yep.
Something's going to have to be created, and until we show those that are going to have to do that creation that just begging kids to come to the schools of education isn't going to work. I'm less than optimistic about action being taken. I don't know whether y'all would call it a sanction or what, but we need to propose some plans and try to see if they can be made positive and can work, and get those that are gonna have to help into the mix. Right now, it's being thrown on the schools of education, go fix it yourself. And that ain't gonna happen.
And Sam, I think we agree with that. We agree that we need the data. And we absolutely agree, and I think that's what the commission was putting forth to the state board, was that we need something to build in to be able to track the data. We just don't need it to be a sanction or something that's punitive unless there's something on the other side, whether it's the General Assembly, there's some type of incentive for folks to pursue teaching.
I hate to use the term too big to fail. Our schools of education are not gonna be put out of business. Probably many should have been a long time ago, but that isn't gonna happen. So until we get to the point that there's an urgency, I think it's just gonna float.
But again, I don't think the urgency is sanctioning. I think the urgency is actually beyond this commission's control. It is money, it is a systems change, it is, and think about North Carolina Teaching Fellows. They put North Carolina Teaching Fellows back in, thank you. But this year, for the past 2 years, they've had a hard time filling it.
It's flawed to begin with, their plan. There's no incentive there to even get in. I mean, you get some educational opportunity, you got all these other things you have to do to pay back the extended time you have to stay in the profession. It's almost debilitating to anybody thinking about their future. So I don't think that's a good example. When we had the other teaching fellow program in place, we had to turn down thousands of kids that wanted in. So the analogy there is not good.
The analogy of sanctioning a school of education for something they don't have control over is not good to me. I think that this is it's just way bigger. Do we need to move on something? Yes, but I cannot support that be a sanction.
We can't vote today, or we'd see how other people think.
That's fine.
Could you put the slide that says more context on the level system, the one that has the levels of, do you have that one available?
Sure we do. I just gotta figure out which one you're referring to.
Yeah, and I mean, it was that one that we talked about, that one right there?
Oh, that's in a different
Okay.
PowerPoint, but we can pull that up probably, or maybe not.
And I wonder, again, going back to the other slide that you had that had the three, where it was where it had the meter exceed a set state standard, a meter exceed an institution average, or year-over-year growth. If you took that idea and synthesize that with the more context on the level system, where you're developing a continuous improvement plan rather than it being a sanction. If an EPP if they do have programs that are doing this and it's an intentional, then that is part of, if you're on a level 2 or if you're on a level 3, you show that. You have that on there and it's aligned to a state standard or an institutional standard or a year-by-year growth. But you're showing literally, instead of being sanctioned and called out, look, we're on a continuous improvement plan here where these are the programs and initiatives that we're doing. This is what we're literally doing to try to change that. And again, I'm just trying to find a balance in the two sides here.
Yeah, I think language, sanction doesn't have to be in the language. Plan and program and progress has got to be there.
We started with that and we're told that's not part of the law. I mean, I proposed that it be what you're looking at plans, and I was told that wasn't gonna be allowed. That like, what's your plan? How are you moving it?
Which,
I mean, but maybe that's changed now. Maybe we can come back to that, because to me, that's a whole different conversation than.
Well, you're putting in a standard, and then you've got a reporting measure, so a way to collect the data, right, and then report back.
Yeah, so for those of us, several of us attended a meeting last night with a panel who was talking about the profession, and one of the interesting pieces that came up, I think, was this idea of rewards versus sanctions. We seem to have not had that conversation, that perhaps we should be incentivizing programs to do this work. Given the fact that they don't control their enrollment, you could incentivize programs in a very
Show us what you're
and show us how you're, and then those programs could become models. I am a little bit concerned that I feel like that there's this overtone of sanctions. There were conversations about why we don't have programs rated at a level 1. Are we intentionally, right? That seems to me like we're really, really running headlong into this idea that we've got to sanction people. And I'm really concerned about that. I don't know that the data sample that we had, I think, only includes traditional EPPs at this point. And like I said earlier, we have a lot of other programs now that are not college-based EPPs. They're not included in the data. And so we don't really know if there are level 1 programs because we don't have everyone reflected.
I believe the term sanction is in your accrediting process.
It is.
So,
It is.
That's across the board.
But
I'm totally in
see what
agreement with everything's being said.
Yeah.
I'm just saying if we don't take some action, come forward with some plans, fail if necessary, I don't see the incentives to support change coming forward. Or somebody's going to change it for you. And that is not going to be pretty.
Other thoughts? Okay, can we go back to the other PowerPoint? I want to go to the second one, number 2, which is slide 9, I believe.
So Wesley, just a quick follow-up.
Sure.
Was there any discussion at the board meeting about the concept of data collection? Or was it strictly a conversation that it was strongly believed that diversity need to be a part of the sanction model versus a data collection? I mean, when I look at this is a perfect model for statewide data collection versus a sanction action. And I'm just trying to wrap my head around some common sense thought on that. Can you elaborate on that?
Well, I did. I'll try, and I don't know if this will answer your question, but what I did do was, essentially what I did for the board was I presented how the commission got to where it was making its decisions, right? And so, insofar as I could do that, I was basically saying, a concern from this commission that was said at the previous commission meetings, I think it was December was when we did this, was there was concern about setting up a sanction associated with a domain that we didn't have enough data to pass judgment on. And so I said very carefully to the board that was a concern, and so the recommendation from the commission was to pilot this, not to throw it to the side and ignore it, but to think very carefully about what you're setting up, so that you don't unintendingly damage EPPs or send them into sanctions for potential missteps. Because you don't have a full picture of the landscape. So that was what was presented. And then the counter back to that was that the issue of diversity was such a compelling and core mission from the board that they really felt compelled to try and include it somehow into the accountability model. Now, they did not say explicitly that it should be a sanctionable event. That never came out of their mouth. What was said was, we don't understand why, if it's a really important issue for the board, why it can't be a part of the accountability model. And so I think that, coupled with what Representative Horn said to a couple of us a couple of times over the past 6 months while we've been grappling with this, is to try to really do some creative thinking and think outside the box to come up with some other ideas. I think some of those have been brought up here, but I also think that it lends itself to the idea that more work needs to be done. We clearly see that this idea, I've heard things from rewards versus sanctions, to setting up some sort of a tiered system, as you mentioned, Freebird. I think there are some things that have been brought up that could be explored. But I think the mission from the board is to include diversity in some capacity, and it does not necessarily have to be a sanction. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, so do you feel that the board is the idea of it being a reportable measure versus a sanctionable measure?
Well, I think we are, if we are collecting the data that we have identified, those 5 different measures, that is certainly reportable data. Whether that can be converted into some sort of a sanctionable, like can we set thresholds? We certainly can. We're hearing amongst the various stakeholders here that there is some risk associated with choices that need to be made. But yeah, we can certainly report all that data as it comes in, as recently or as soon as the first reporting collection coming up.
Great sound effects.
Star Wars movie.
Yes, EdTPA and PPAT. So the second area that they brought back for this body to consider is, again, this idea that domain 1, right now, the 4 measures are of equal weight. If there is a belief that EdTPA and PPAT falls closest under the jurisdiction and control of the EPP, could it potentially be weighted more and have more influence over that domain 1? And then the second point is this idea of, is it already implicitly functioning as the strongest contributor in that domain anyway? And I'm going to look back and see if Dr. Tomerlin would come up and talk through that really quickly, because I think it's important for folks to understand what we mean when we're saying that, and I think he's going to do a better job of explaining that than me.
So I'm going to try not to get too nerdy about this, but the issue that we have with EdTPA and EVOS being in the same domain is that there's this idea of nominal weighting. Here's how I say I'm going to weight things. And then there's what's called effective weighting. Here's how that measure actually contributes to the overall rating. And those two things are often different. And a great example of this is our teacher evaluation system before we dropped student growth from the model. So we weighted all those things exactly equally. All 6 standards were equally weighted. But when you looked at what caused a teacher to be rated in need of improvement, 9 times out of 10, it was EVOS that was causing that issue. And so even though we said it carries the same weight, effectively we knew that the EVOS contribution to that overall rating was massive compared to the contribution of the other 5 standards. And what I'm concerned about here, and what we need to fix here and understand, and this is an empirical question, is how much weight statistically is EVOS contributing to the overall outcome of that measure versus what PPAT is. And I think we're going to have a bit of a similar problem, because the data that we get from most universities is that they've got fairly good high pass rates on the EdTPA, and then the EVOS is going to be the thing that really determines the outcome of the measure. And that's the situation we have to grapple with here, is to understand what's the right weighting of that. And that's an empirical question, not a philosophical question, so that the EdTPA functions the way that we're articulating here, that you have the most control over that, therefore that should be the strongest measure, and that's going to result in some really heavy differentiation in the weight that we assign to each of those measures within the domain. If we leave them equal, EVOS will swallow EdTPA, and that's basically what you're contending. I want to make sure.
That's only in tested subjects.
That's only in tested subjects, yes.
Tom, can you remind me, or one of y'all remind me, how long EdTPA has been, consequential?
It became consequential for all program completers as of September 1st, 2019. Prior to that, we required you to implement for 30% of your graduating.
And what year was that?
That started in 2017, I think.
We've had a couple, but the point is we don't have a full, this year will be the first full year of data on EdTPA and PPAT.
Right.
So I am definitely using the 30%. We don't know how you, my guess is that you did not randomly assign your students to take the EdTPA, so we may not have really good data on what those pass rates are going to be.
It may have been more of a voluntold.
Yeah, right. And so we're not trying to put too much emphasis on the data that we have right now, but it does seem that EdTPA, the data we have right now suggests that EdTPA would not be as strong a differentiator among programs as the EVOS outcomes would.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Thank you.
Okay, so that's, if we can go to the next slide then. So, and again, I'm just kind of rolling through here. So the questions that would need to be answered here would be, does this commission want to increase the value of the EdTPA, PPAT in domain 1? That's sort of a yes or no. And then what are the new values for each of the 4 domains or what are the 4 variables in the domains going to be valued at, right? And it sounds like there's some empirical things that need to be thought about before implementation on that. The third one would be the survey minimum, and that's the argument from the board there is just to make sure that the survey outcomes are valid and representative of the EPP. So we don't want to cast judgment on an EPP if we have a very small sample size associated with that. Since that conversation came up, I've been working behind the scenes to start working on looking at a process to explore that so that we can set those expectations. That is a very doable process there. Yes. Yeah.
I'm sorry. I'm taking the role of the of the practical side of this as he represents the policy. But what I would need to be clear here that this is, when we say minimum, we don't mean just an N of responses and a percentage of the response rate. It has to get a little deeper than that for the validity measure. So is it representative across your subgroups? Is it representative across your license areas? There's a lot of ways we have to look at this to ensure that the data that we're giving you is generalizable to the program writ large, not just if it's all your elementary teachers in the sample, then we can't generalize that to your middle school programs or your high school programs. And so I just want to make sure that it's a little more, everybody understands it's a little more complicated than I have to have this many teachers answering the question. They have to be representative within your subgroups and with your program areas.
Okay, and then let's see here. A couple more questions associated with that topic. One is what happens if an EPP falls below the identified, these threshold that's been established, and should Pepsi consider requiring participation in the 2 surveys to force higher response rates? So that's something that we've talked about internally since I got here, which is the idea that if you're going to require a survey, then there should be something in policy that requires that people take the survey, because right now the response rate is not robust. It's high 40%. And if it's the will of Pepsi to change or make a policy that says, the beginning teachers have to take this instrument and employers have to take this instrument, and we get a higher response rate, then we have more data that we can pull from and make better decisions from. So that is something that Pepsi's going to have to think about in considering next steps as a way to help with this process and collect more robust data. The fourth topic then is the last one, and that has to do with extending the sanctioning period. The argument from the board there was this idea of, starting with a warning and then having a very difficult, like quicksand, having a very difficult time to be able to get out. And I know we had talked about a couple of ideas. If memory serves, I think, Dr. Marr, you might have mentioned the idea of suggesting extending a year in the probationary time frame. Because we brought it up but didn't have a very specific thing, I think it's coming back to you all to make a very concrete recommendation. This is how we want to handle this going forward. So that one's pretty straight ahead. So anyway, those are the four topics that came back from a direct motion with the board when they looked at the model. And again, I can't impress upon you enough how complex this is. The subgroups have been working tirelessly on this. It gave me a great joy to have to present to the JLEOC that those subgroups have met 16 times since the beginning of this process, which is a really heavy lift. And yeah, there are some things that need to still be worked out. And so I leave it to you all to think about what next steps you'd like to make towards addressing deeper thought in these four areas. And we'll help manage that accordingly, depending on how you'd like to proceed.
We need to wait. We need to send this back to the other subcommittee. We need more discussion before we move forward with the motion.
Okay, so your suggestion, Dr. Marr, is to send it back to the subcommittee to think more carefully about those four specific areas, and then bring that back to the full commission when they're ready?
When we're fully ready to do that. Okay. Thank you, Drs. Syberg, Tomberlin, Evans. Next, Dr. Evans will introduce a proposed permanent rule focusing on requesting a residency license.
Good morning again. The rule that I'm going to give you a preview, which I wanted to explain the rule and then let you know what the next steps will be, is about requesting a residency license, and there's three parts to it. Part A talks about, I'm just going to go ahead and read it since we don't have it up. For the purposes of requesting a residency license on behalf of an individual, a local board of education includes the governing body of any school system or school operating in the state of North Carolina. So this rule comes from requests from the field to be able to request a residency license outside of being an LEA. So this right here would help others out in the field, such as private schools, charter schools, Cherokee schools, DOE schools within the state, to be able to request a residency license on behalf of an individual, even though they do not have what an official local board of education, they have a governing body of a school system or school operating in the state of North Carolina. So this would be able to include these types of schools. Part B talks about any North Carolina private school with a state board of education approved beginning teacher support program may request a residency license on behalf of an individual employed by the private school. So what it says in TCED 016, which is about the beginning teacher support program, that all schools, whether they are LEA, charter, or private schools, that they have to have an approved beginning teacher support program in order to support those teachers who have an IPL to then convert to a CPL. So this is just making it clear that private schools would have that responsibility, which is also through TCED 016 as well. And then Part C talks about the requesting body must verify the individual's enrollment in an approved EPP when requesting a residency license on behalf of an individual. So that is like any other school system, you have to have that EPP support and they have to sign off on it with that RL form through licensure. So it's just like any other LEA. So I wanted to ask if there are any questions or comments about the rule itself first. Okay. So the second part is that this is a preview because this rule would go for approval as a permanent rule. But what has to happen first is a fiscal note will have to be written. But we wanted to get your approval on the text before we go ahead and write a fiscal note. And then you say, no, the text doesn't make sense. Then we need to redo the fiscal note. But eventually this will come back to you with a fiscal note, and then it will go to the state board for approval. And then it will go on to Rules Review Commission, OAH. That whole process for permanent rulemaking.
Sorry, I just want to clarify one thing. So we have to have this. The other issue that I want to address is we're going to seek a technical correction in the statute when they return for session, but we're doing our due diligence to make the rule and go that route in case we don't get the technical correction, because this is just an oversight. I think the intent was to incorporate those schools which historically have always been able to support lateral entry, but we're doing a dual path here. So it could be that we retract all this from you, but we would not be doing our due diligence if we didn't start the process.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Evans. Now, Dr. Tomberlin will discuss a survey focusing on the Masters of School Administration programs for North Carolina Educator Preparation Programs.
Is that Robert? Is that Robert?
Oh, sorry. Okay, so we're going to do, before we get to the Master of School Administration, we're going to do State of the Teaching Profession Report and recommendations for measuring effectiveness for teachers who administer North Carolina final exams.
Well, I want to be very clear that not being prepared to speak on a subject never stopped me from doing so. So, but I will continue with the agenda.
It's not a requirement.
So last week I presented to the State Board of Education on the annual report of the state of the teaching profession. Right. That's the right item? I'm sorry. Okay. So this is an annual report that the department generates that basically measures the health of the teaching profession in North Carolina, and really looks at how teachers, whether or not teachers are leaving the state or moving within the state from one school district or charter school to another. I shouldn't have said it that way, whether they're leaving a school district to another school district or a charter school. So the point of my clarification is that we focus, the primary focus is on LEAs, our traditional LEAs. Charter schools are not included in this report, though they are included in counts of teachers across the state. So the first thing that I pointed out to the board was that the size of our teaching force is relatively stable over the last 3 years that we've measured the report in this way. I do want to notify the commission that this report changed dramatically from the 2015-16 school year from the 2014-15 to the 15-16 school year. In those prior reports, we used a collective term of turnover, and that captured teachers moving across the state as well as out of the state. And so this report kind of just separates those things, and so those results are not comparable. So we try to, 15-16 is our base year, and then we look at the statistics from there. So what you can see is that the attrition is steadily declining. It's a small percentage, but we've got about 0.6% percentage point decline over those years. And I can tell you that in 2015-16, the attrition rate was 9.0. So for the 4 years that we've been measuring this, we're showing small but steady decline in the attrition rate. The mobility rate across the state is fairly stable at 4.5%. But what you'll see from this report, if you look at it closely, is that mobility rate and the attrition rate are not uniform across the state. That some of our regions are particularly high in these measures, and some are extremely low. So the first thing that I want to point out to you is the attrition by years of experience, and this is kind of a bowl-shaped graph where from years about 12 to 22, you see kind of the lowest rate of attrition among our teaching force. And then, of course, our beginning teachers experience higher than average attrition. And then around year 27, you see a spike in that, where teachers enter who are eligible for full retirement. Now, what I did point out to the board is a 27-year veteran in the teaching profession is still a fairly young person, and so this is not policy irrelevant. Are there incentives that can help us keep these, young, relatively young folks in the profession? And are there even retirement incentives that could help us keep these teachers in the profession longer than the traditional 30 years? Now, on the other side, you see the beginning teacher attrition is hovering around 12% or so, and that starts to decline after year 5. I also want to point out that this attrition rate is not uniform across preparation type or entry type into the state. And what I mean by that is we know from data, from analyzing the data, that after 5 years, roughly 70% of our traditionally prepared teachers are remaining in the classroom. After 5 years, about 48% of our alternatively prepared teachers are still in the classroom. And about 48% of our out-of-state teachers remain in the classroom at that 5-year mark. So that's a pretty extraordinary difference in the persistence of those teachers from those program types. So I don't say that to, I love our traditional EPPs. I'm not saying that as they're the best. I'm saying we have areas of improvement for these other types. Understanding what is causing that attrition, and what we can do to shore up and achieve those 70% retention rates after year 5 for all of our beginning teachers. The next category is categories. You can see that we kind of isolated out experienced licensed teachers and looked at their attrition rate, which is about 6.8% across the state. And then you can see other subgroups of beginning teachers and what their relative attrition rate is. And you can see that if there was a big, I'll use Dr. Marr's words, elephant in the room to attack, it's the high attrition rates at the early side of the profession. Getting better understanding about what is driving that higher attrition rate can help us develop policies and incentives to address it. We do collect data on the reasons for why these teachers are leaving the state, and we kind of categorize that. Personal reasons is the greatest driver, and I will tell you that retirement is under personal reasons. Some of the other reasons in there are not necessarily policy relevant, like, I take that back. Some of them, retirement may or may not be, but there are also things like dissatisfaction with teaching. Certainly that is something that can be addressed. And then you've got the initiated by LEA. These are often outright dismissals or resign in lieu of dismissal, those kinds of things. I like to think of this one as kind of the good cholesterol. You're really actively winnowing out people that are not helping our students grow and learn, and those rates probably should be lower than what we're seeing, but they also are not necessarily a negative when we talk about teacher attrition. And then you got beyond the control of the LEA. These are just things that, you know, my spouse is moving, my family's moving, I have to stop working to take care of my children, my parents, whatever those reasons may be. They largely are not seen as anything the LEA could have done to kind of stem that attrition. And then finally, other reasons. These are a lot of these are. We'll get some data sometimes, but we won't. But they just don't fit into any of our categories, and we put them in this other reasons bucket. I will tell you that when they select other reasons and they provide some narrative, if that narrative matches one of our reasons, we go ahead and change the reason code. Some people think that I'm moving to Nebraska isn't captured in I'm moving to another state, so we go ahead and transfer that over. And so these other reasons really are reasons that don't fit into any other category. Every year we look at what is the effectiveness of the teachers who remain in the profession versus those who left the profession. Of course, this is a subset of the teaching of both groups because not all teachers have EVOS data. But what you can see here, we're looking at the composite, the overall effectiveness of these teachers. Those who remain in the profession are measurably better, more effective, let me put it that way, are measurably more effective than the teachers who leave the profession. I think what's really interesting in this is that 15 to 19 year, there's just a decided dip in the effectiveness of those who left the profession. We don't know if this is kind of self-selection that, if I'm not effective after 15 years, then maybe I need to be doing something else. We don't know what the causes are necessarily, but we do know that is the largest gap between those two groups is in the 15 to 19 year range in terms of their effectiveness. This, as I alluded to earlier, attrition is not uniform across the state. You can see if you just glance at any region with the word east in it and or hills and contrast that with any region that has west in it, you're going to see some major differences there in their attrition rates. Sorry, is that me? Oh, okay. I think that one thing that's not in this report that's really important if you delve into this report, we calculate what we call a recoupment rate, and that is the ability of a district to capture experienced teachers who are moving throughout the state and replace their losses with experienced North Carolina teachers. That's a really important measure for us to understand the attrition. And what you'll find is that the West traditionally is much better about recouping their losses with experienced teachers than the East. It's not just that the East's attrition rates are higher, they are mainly replacing those losses with brand new teachers. And so that, of course, has an impact on effectiveness and their ability to close achievement gaps and all kinds of things like that. And then finally, we look at vacancy rates for North Carolina schools. So this is calculated, the number's a little different here because it's calculated on FTEs, not people. And so we reported across the state about 97,000 teaching positions. On the first day of school, there were 3,107 vacancies, which was about 3.2% vacancy rate across the state on the first day of school. We capture that again on the 40th day, and there we have a 1.8% vacancy rate on the 40th day of school. What I need to be very, very careful about with these numbers is that the 1,698 is not the exact same ones that were vacant on day one. This could be a completely different set of vacancies than what we experienced. So in other words, the districts could have cleared out all the vacancies on day 20, and then on day 40, you've got 1,700 more vacancies that they did not have at the beginning of the year. I always stress this because vacancy is not a annual event, or it's not a fall event that districts deal with. It is a continuous issue throughout the academic year.
Tom, may I ask a question here?
Sure.
I do believe when you all collected the data this year, you tried to educate those of us in the field to make sure, and, and I don't know how accurate that is still, even with that education, that number, 3107, even if we had filled the classroom by collapsing, right, because a lot of us do that, we end up collapsing a class, sections, buying back planning periods from teachers, or we put retirees in there working within the confines of the law. So that number this time is supposed to include those as vacancies.
Yes,
right?
and I would have to say that I am pretty confident that it does, because last year this was 1.5%. Okay. And so just to clarify what we mean by this, we've told the LEAs in this reporting, if you hire a long-term sub, that doesn't count as filling a vacancy.
So that is a vacancy.
That is a
Still a
vacancy.
vacancy.
Even though there is a teacher in that classroom, if it's not the licensed teacher that you are installing as a permanent full-time solution to that vacancy, we want you to count the vacancy. So rehired retirees count as vacancies. Collapsing teachers buying back planning periods, those count, because they're not solutions to the issue. And we're not trying to inflate anything in this. We're just trying to get a very clear picture of what's going on day one that districts are having to deal with, what's going on day 40. We could measure this for every multiple of 40 on out, and you're probably going to see something very similar to the 1.8.
Because I've allotted that school
Makes
the
sense.
position, right?
Right.
And I've given you the position, but you can't fill it.
I experienced this as a parent this semester. My daughter had no Math 3 teacher after the second week of school. There was a person there, right? But that's a vacancy.
That is a
wasn't
vacancy.
a math teacher.
Yeah. And if we don't count it that way, we're doing a disservice to the issue of the pipeline, the front end of the pipeline.
Yeah.
I can say that we're under the business modernization effort going on in North Carolina. We're hoping we can get better data to identify and help the district see where we're seeing the vacancies and how they can look at this, because this is self-report, and as Mrs. Jones pointed out, there may be some confusion among LEAs about what to count, what not to count. So this measure, it's an important measure, but we keep refining and making sure that everybody is reporting consistently across the measure. And then finally, we give you a breakdown of the vacancies by subject area. I articulated what I felt was the deficiency in this particular analysis to the board, and I will do to you as well. It doesn't, what we should have there is the total number of vacancies and the vacancy rates across this. The way we're doing it now, K-5 will always pop up on top just because there's more of those, but what percentage of the available positions across the state does that represent? And that's how we get a better view of what are our really hard to staff subjects. If that represents, 2% of all the K-5 classrooms, that may not be as important as if that exceptional children's number represents, 25% of our EC positions across the state. So we will work on that to bring you better reporting on the issue.
Do you, like the 912 science, do you break that out in any way as it relates to the type of licensure that they have?
You mean, am I looking?
General science, somebody that's
am I
going to teach
looking at
science,
physics?
biology, physics, and chemistry.
Right. We
Or
are
do you
not
have
looking
a-
at this from the licensure area perspective. That's a question of granularity. If folks feel like that is an important level of granularity for us to go to, we can certainly do that. You know, one of our goals is to get people to actually read the report. And so if you hand them 57 pages of data, chances are it sits in a bin. But if you can hand them 25 to 30 pages of really good information, we hope that they will look at it. But your point is well taken, and we want this to serve the needs of stakeholders. So we could certainly do that.
I would probably be the only one that'd be interested, but.
That's great. So one other point I want to raise from the state board is that this report does not disaggregate the attrition by race or ethnicity. And as the board has articulated their desire for information on diversity in our teaching population, it was suggested that we could look at the attrition by teacher demographics. And we do have that data, and we have always maintained just a consistent reporting model over the years unless someone asks us to change it. And the board did formally ask us to incorporate that diversity. So the report that goes back in March will contain that diversity breakdown of, and really what we're looking at is the attrition higher for certain subgroups than it is for others? Are African American teachers leaving at much greater rates than the overall population? And so that will be included in the next iteration. Any questions? Great. So another presentation we made to the board concerns Senate Bill 621, which was the Testing Reduction Act of 2019. And that piece of legislation eliminated the North Carolina final exams as part of the statewide not accountability, but testing program. Within that requirement to eliminate the North Carolina final exams was another request from the State Board of Education, the Department of Public Instruction, to recommend another means to measure effectiveness for the teachers who were covered by the North Carolina final exams. And so just to give you a quick recap of what courses we're talking about here, North Carolina's final exams are administered. There's some very unique cases where they might be in elementary, but by and large, there are no North Carolina final exams in elementary. But in middle school, this would be science and social studies in the 6th and 7th grade, and then social studies only in the 8th grade, because the 8th grade science has an EOG. In high school, it covers all core subjects: math, reading, math, English, science, and social studies, except for 3 courses that have an EOC, and that is biology, English 2, and math 3, and in some cases math 1. So that is the breadth of subject areas that are covered by the North Carolina final exams.
Say the 8th grade science?
8th grade science is covered by an EOG, not by a North Carolina final exam. So that will continue to be, and that is part of the accountability model. So it will continue to be implemented. So as part of trying to figure this out, I met with some a variety of stakeholders. So I have put this in front of the Teacher Recruitment and Retention Task Force to talk about this. I have talked with granting folks and education advocates in North Carolina about their thoughts on this. Belk Foundation put together a group of national researchers to let me kind of talk about thoughts on this and help me understand if there was anything I was missing, or if certain proposals might be counterproductive or unproductive. And that was certainly a helpful conversation to have. And so at the end of all that stakeholder input, the Department of Public Instruction put forward 5 options for measuring growth for these teachers who were previously covered by the North Carolina final exams. So I want to make some assumptions. I want to let you know some assumptions I made about this. My assumption was that the General Assembly were looking for measures that were valid, reliable, and differentiated among teachers in the way that the North Carolina final exams would. And so with that in mind, I proposed to the State Board of Education that there were 5 options, reasonable options they could choose from. One is student surveys. North Carolina has a long history of implementing student surveys on a voluntary basis. We piloted a survey in North Carolina, which ultimately led to the development of what's called the Panorama Survey. It's a student survey fairly similar to the tripod survey developed out of Harvard. I don't know if any of you remember the 7 C's of the tripod survey. And so these students' perceptions can be used to understand how they're experiencing their educational experience through classroom climate, engagement, perseverance, pedagogical effectiveness of their teachers, their personal interests, their sense of school belonging, the teacher academic press, and the valuing of the subject matter. These can be implemented depending on how many scales. All those things I listed are potential scales that you could measure, you could get students' response to. Some can be left out. Some can. Of the model, depending on how many you implement, it usually takes about 30 to 60 minutes to implement per course. There are decided pros and cons to this. The pros are that it's a student-centered measure. It can inform a variety of school improvement efforts as well as individual teacher. It correlates relatively well with student growth measures. There's low stakes, low pressure for students. There's no passing or failing a perception survey. And can cover additional untested subjects, such as your arts and physical education. The cons are there's concern over whether students are sufficiently mature to offer objective feedback. So if I don't like my teacher, does that mean I rate his or her performance lower? Concern over how the data will be used vis-a-vis teacher evaluation. Is this a gotcha for teachers? And then there's the concern over manipulation of students. Can students be pressured into answering certain ways? The next measure is what we're calling student learning objectives. I'm just going to be very brief and to the point on this one. This is basically what we tried to conduct with the analysis of student work, across the state. That was also killed by legislation. It is a much more teacher-focused endeavor where the teacher identifies the standards that he or she will be measuring their students' growth on. It is a performance-based endeavor. It requires the assessment of the artifacts by another observer. There's some questions about the validity and reliability about those observers. If you'll go to the next slide. It is another student-centered measure because it is students actually doing something to demonstrate their growth. It allows for personalization. It is much more integrated into instruction than a traditional standalone assessment. It can accommodate local context, and it can cover additional untested subjects. The cons here: lack of security, extensive third-party review, and an appeal process for those who get a lower score, and potential lack of validity and reliability across and within assessments. I do have to say that we did not see, when we conducted this as ASW, we did not see a lack of reliability in the models that we, by and large, the way we conducted this is we had 2 independent raters. If they agreed, then that was the score. If they disagreed, it was arbitrated by a third. In most cases, we had very little third-person arbitration on those measures. By and large, the teachers were aligned. Now, the validity, I do have to say that this measure lacked face validity among the people who were being evaluated, but that's a little bit of a different question. Next, we offered formative assessments. So if you look at the legislation, Part 2 of that legislation starts talking about a personalized assessment system where you're doing through grade assessment. So basically, this is a formative assessments administered 3 times a year or 4 times a year. But not at the end, you're not doing this comprehensive summative. You're getting information on the student learning throughout the year. And so when I saw this, I thought, well, why wouldn't you use this for other subjects? And if this is a direction that the General Assembly is acknowledging the way they would like to see assessment go, it might be a nice way to integrate into that. Currently, there are assessment systems that do this kind of thing, but they're largely limited to math and reading and in the elementary and middle school grades. Data could be collected from this, theoretically, data could be collected from this this system throughout the academic year and used to develop an overall growth measure for those teachers. Some of the cons, the pros are it provides much more timely feedback for instructional improvement. Teachers are seeing results in real time. They're not waiting till the fall of the next year to see how their students performed. It allows for differentiated instruction, standardization across the state, and it is embedded in instruction rather than standalone. The cons are the time needed for implementation. This could not be a solution for 2021. It increases statewide standardized testing. It does not eliminate, so that could be contrary to the whole, if the bill's name is Testing Reduction Act of 2019, it doesn't seem like it achieves that goal. Increases cost and time of implementation for LEAs. LEAs now don't have basically one testing window at the end of the year. They have 4 throughout the year, and it is still theoretical for determining effectiveness. Next is computer adaptive testing. I think you all know what this is. Basically, we're advocating for could we do this and do it quicker and be less intrusive in the school year for these folks. We would still get good, reliable data on the teacher's effectiveness, but can we make this happen sooner? So the pros here are that you're not taking a whole day to assess an NCFE. You'll probably get more precise estimates of the student achievement level, and it's a valid and reliable assessment tool. Do we have the technology to support this across the state? Is this an equity issue for some of our states? These things generally these types of tests don't really cover the breadth of the content standards. They focus, they go deep into kind of core standards and to determine that achievement level, and it is potentially expensive. And then finally, observation evaluation. So it was put to me in some of my stakeholder input that we have an evaluation system in the state. Currently, like many other states, it does not differentiate well among teachers, but it is required in legislation. So would the better investment be helping increase the validity and reliability of that instrument across the state so that it could support an inference of effectiveness for our teachers? Again, there are pros and cons to this. We're already doing this in the state, so this is not a new program. It's a more holistic view of teacher effectiveness, greater opportunities for feedback and coaching, and it has a continuous improvement orientation. The cons are it's costly for necessary improvements. Dr. Marr referenced a meeting we went to last night. Tennessee talked about this, implementing a calibration requirement for all principals. In order to evaluate, you had to pass the calibration requirement. That is a big endeavor with a lot of implications. Currently, our system lacks the validity of its relationship to student outcomes, and the current implementation already is onerous for our districts and schools. So those are the 5 options we presented. The board asked me to They thanked me for my 5 options, but they asked me to bring back one recommendation for next month. And so we will be offering a single recommendation for how we do this at the March meeting. I do want to make a point about why this relates to you. Directly, it does not impact, this is not a licensure or an ed prep measure, of course, so we did not formally bring this to Pepsi for approval before we went to the board, but I do say there is indirect connection. The effectiveness of a teacher does have implications for their ability to renew the license, and so that does have a connection to you as the licensing agents. Also, any measure we develop for effectiveness for a teacher would come back as a measure in the accountability model for an EPP. So there is indirect connection, and we thought you should be aware of this and how it's moving through the process.
Stay up there.
Can I go ahead and talk about the survey? Oh, yeah. Yes. So the state board also made a request of us to conduct a survey of our Masters of School Administration programs across the state. There's some question about, some general questions about our policies around administrator preparation. And one of the first things that the board would like information on is the internship period for our MSA programs. And so the board has asked that we conduct a survey to find out from our preparation programs what is the length, the required length of an internship in order to be recommended for an MSA. A lot of our schools across the state or EPPs across the state have a 10-month internship. And of course, as many of you know, that up to 10 months of an internship is supported with a stipend from the state for full-time program completers. But some schools haven't been able to, felt like they couldn't achieve that the cost to the candidate was excessive, so they've opted for 5-month internships. And there's some questions about whether there is any time requirement at all for some of our EPPs for an internship program. So we're going to be surveying the MSAs for that information. We will bring you that survey. Do we need to approve that survey before we send it out?
It's a great question. I was not paying attention.
Yeah, I wasn't either, and I was talking.
Survey needs to be approved.
Yes, does the board need to approve, does Pepsi and the board need to approve the survey that we send out?
Tom, I'm gonna have to answer that question for you at another time.
That sounds great.
Nobody heard that online.
Oh,
We'll provide an answer soon.
the state board attorney will provide us an answer to that question soon. We're going to operate under the assumption that we don't need to. That was a pretty direct and specific question from the board that doesn't have policy implication. Right now, it doesn't have policy implications. It seems to me that the policy that comes from that survey result would be more important to discuss and vote on than the actual information itself. But we will begin developing that survey, and then we'll wait for direction from the board on whether it needs to be approved formally by the board and Pepsi or not.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Dr. Tomlin.
Yeah.
We're going to move the Principal Standards Committee update to the next meeting. And so we'll hear from Dr. Sox next meeting, if that's okay. Thank you for being here. Sorry. Time. Thank you, commission members, advisors, and staff for your preparation for the discussions. I remind commission members that our next monthly meeting will be held in this room on Thursday, March 12th from 9 a.m. to 12 p.m. We've now completed our meeting, and unless there's additional business at this time, I ask for a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
It's been moved and seconded. All in favor? Aye. Thank you all. Yep.
Good job, Michael.
Well, except where I jumped ahead over here.
That's okay.